Greetings everyone, and welcome to this second video looking at the democracy unit in A-Level Politics, paper 1. In the previous video we talked about the two forms of democracy, which you can see behind me, and we focused particularly on this idea of direct democracy, the idea that there could be this country or this state somewhere where all of the citizens make all of the decisions together in some sort of kind of direct decision-making democracy. And we talked about what the advantages and disadvantages of that would be. However, most countries around the world that are democracies use the model we see on the right, a representative democracy where individuals and citizens like you and me will elect a representative, a person or persons who will go and make decisions on our behalf for a certain amount of time. And in our country, the process of choosing a person to make those decisions is called an election, and the people we choose are called members of parliament. And different countries do it in different ways. They have different types of elections for choosing their representatives, and they call their representatives different things. Members of parliament, senators, representatives, and all sorts of others, I'm sure. Presidents, perhaps, and so on. But the idea here in a representative democracy is that the people will choose certain people to be their representatives and to make decisions for them. And this video will be looking at what that exactly means and what exactly that is good, why that might be good and why that might be bad. In some way, just checking the sound is working. Yes, it does seem to be. So hopefully everything is great. So at the moment we're in or the school I'm teaching here is Gerrards Cross, and so I thought it might be a good idea to kind of show you your representatives, to kind of show you an idea of how representative democracy kind of functions for you. And because you don't just have one representative, or sometimes it might feel like that, but actually you have many, and depending on where you live in the country, you might have a few more and a few less. And if you lived in some countries like America, the number of representatives you have at different levels is huge. Let me go through and you'll see what I mean. First of all, we have Barbara, and Barbara is your local councillor. So she is elected to your local government. Only the people in your local ward or constituency will vote for her. We're talking here maybe kind of just a few roads or a small area will vote for a local councillor that will work on local issues. And so it's things like collecting the rubbish, looking after the parks, looking after the streets, making sure that any kind of problems are kind of taken care of, communicating with the police and dealing with any kind of disturbances. In many ways, she's probably the most important person in your life, because most of the issues that we all have day to day are related to things like traffic or local conveniences and things like that. So although many of you may not have heard of Barbara, although she did visit our school a couple of years ago and she's absolutely lovely, she is your local representative, and I can't remember the term exactly on it, but every few years you get to vote and re-vote for your local councillor. Different councils do it slightly differently. So for example, where I live in Watford, we have all these little local councillors that are responsible for certain wards, which is a tiny part of a constituency, and then they all meet together in what is called the local council, where all these kind of councillors kind of meet together. That's where the word council, local council, councillors all kind of fits together. And they kind of meet together with all the local councillors and kind of decide on bigger issues altogether, such as planning permission. Can you build a new supermarket here? Can you build a new block of flats here? How much money are we going to put into the local park? Are we going to have Christmas lights this year? You know, things that in some ways seem kind of minor, but actually for the people that live in the local area, these things are very, very, very important. So whilst Barbara, whilst a local councillor isn't going to be making huge decisions about coronavirus or going to war or things like that, these are the people that are involved in your local council tax, in helping your street, assuming you don't live on a private road, stay clean, stay safe, and so on. Now, many cities now also have elected mayors, and I've put a picture there of oh my god, I've just forgotten his name. Khan. I've forgotten his first name. That's bad, isn't it? But the London mayor. Many big cities now have elected well-known mayors. London has one, Watford has one, has had one for many years, Liverpool, Manchester, lots of other places have moved towards this elected mayor system. And this is important because it means that then not just kind of a local councillor has a kind of a group, but there's actually kind of a figurehead for the city. And this has become even more important in the coronavirus, when we've heard people like Andy Burnham and other mayors really kind of standing up for their cities and saying, well, we want this restriction, or we don't want this restriction, or you're harming our jobs, or we should have this lockdown, or we shouldn't have this lockdown. And so it means that these local mayors really have the ability to represent their local cities, to lobby on their behalf to national governments, but also to start things like new initiatives. You might have heard things like Boris Bikes, or the congestion zone, or I'm just kind of thinking of things that have kind of taken place in London as initiatives of the London Mayor and so on. And you often get to see posters around when you go into London saying, this was, this is brought to you by the London Mayor or something like that. But it means that there is someone who is responsible for the city as a whole to come up with new ideas, to think about how you might kind of pay for that, to represent that city on a kind of a national stage. And I think we're going to see the importance of these mayors increase rather than decrease, because at the moment we do seem to be on a kind of a trajectory that local governments are becoming more important, which is basically extending the devolution idea, which we've talked about before. Speaking of devolution, and the next link behind me is regional government. If you live in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, then as well as your national parliament in Westminster, you also have not just a council, but an entire legislative chamber, which is your regional parliament. So famously the Scottish Parliament, the Northern Ireland Assembly, and so on. And I've put a picture of Nicola Sturgeon there, who's the current First Minister in Scotland, which is essentially like having a Prime Minister for your region. You could, in theory, get a situation where you get a local councillor for your ward, a mayor for your city, a first minister for your region, and that's before you even get to the national government. What can the regional government do? Well, more all the time. The government seems to be giving more and more powers to the devolved assemblies. So if you live in Scotland now, you're probably aware that they have free tuition fees. We've talked about this a few months ago when we talked about devolution policies, but tax, education, health, some of the judicial system, many of the laws are now devolved. And of course, looking at what's happened with coronavirus, you can see that Scotland, Ireland, Northern Wales are working on very kind of independent policies which have been thought of and put together by their first ministers and their executives. And to use terminology from the rest of our course, these regional parliaments have their own legislatures, executives, and in some cases their own judiciary systems as well. So there's a lot of different bits of representation going on here. Now, then, of course, there is the national government, which is behind me here, which famously would be your local MP, which is what we mostly think of when we think about elections. In Gerrards Cross, it used to be Dominic Grieve, but I'll come back to that point a little bit later. And once every 4 to 5 years, or less, depending on which year you're living in, you get to vote, you put a tick in a box, and whichever person gets the most votes becomes the MP. They go off to Westminster and they represent that constituency of whether it be Watford or Chalfont or whichever location it might be. The idea being that every single location in the UK has a representative in Parliament to speak up for its interests. Now, we used to also have a representative in the European Parliament, which is what the gentleman here at the bottom was. But of course, we have now left the European Union. Brexit has occurred. So whilst we used to be represented in the European Union and we used to elect them, we now do not, because they no longer exist. Well, sorry, they do exist, but they don't exist for Britain. Now, Dominic Grieve has, of course, been replaced in 2019, which is one of the important points about representatives, and this is a key point. A representative can be re-elected or replaced because they are, key term, accountable. If people like what their MP have done, their representative has done, they can continue to vote for them and they can continue to have them as part of their representing them in Parliament, and the same goes for mayors and the other representatives, and if they don't like them, they can get rid of them. And famously, Dominic Grieve was a Remainer, but Gerrards Cross was more of a Brexit area, and so he broke with his local constituency and the Conservative Party and said, well, I'm going to support the Remain side, and his constituents voted him out. So he was accountable for the decisions he made. You can decide whether you agree or disagree with him in this policy, but the point is he was accountable. He could be removed for the decisions he made. And I think the last bit of animation there will remove our European representative for you. So those are so let's summarize what we've learned so far. You have more than one representative. You have perhaps many different representatives at many different levels who are responsible for different things. Some of them are legislatures creating laws and rules. Others are perhaps more figureheads, or they make kind of policy changes. And the difference between a law and a policy, I think you probably understand, but a law is an instruction which we have to follow. A policy might be increasing funding to education or something like that. So these are our representatives. But how does a representative actually represent the people? How does that actually work? Because the whole point of a representative, or when you say you represent something, it means you stand for something else. Now, this is where this idea gets a bit more complex, because actually a representative can represent in different ways depending on what's kind of going on in their heads and how the system works. First and foremost, in the UK, and we're just focusing on our MPs here, there is constituency representation. So when that MP goes off to London, Westminster, they could well be thinking, well, what does my local area want? What does Watford want? What does Gerrards Cross need? What does the people there think? What does my area actually want? What's in their kind of best interest? So the first way is to have this MP constituency link. And if you want to speak to your MP or write to your MP, you can, and they will respond. You might not like their response. It might not be a great response, but it probably will be. Most MPs work very hard in what's called their MP constituency link. And you can even go and see them in a constituency meeting. And if you invite them to your school or so on, they will, when they have time, they will almost certainly come when they can. But an MP also represents a party. Now, when you go and vote, you're voting as a person that lives in a certain area, but most people these days vote Labour, Conservatives, Lib Dems, SNP, Green Party, and so on. And all of those MPs, or nearly all of those MPs, are members of parties. And so when they go to Parliament, they often are thinking, well, what does my local area want? But also, well, what does my party say? What's my party leader said? What was in our local manifesto, and so on. And I've put a little note here that UK whipping is far stronger than other countries. In our political system, most of our MPs will vote along party lines most of the time, even if that perhaps goes against the wishes of their local residents or goes against the needs of their local area. Not always, and there are exceptions. For example, Boris famously voted against or avoided voting for HS2 because he didn't think it was right for his kind of local area and constituency. But MPs also are, of course, human beings, and they have their own gender, race, class, job, religion, previous history, of so on, and so they also perform a social and functional representation. One of the topics we'll be looking at is what percentage of ethnic minorities and percentage of women and percentage of LGBTQ people are in Parliament, and talking about how people are represented according to perhaps their different demographics, as well as their constituencies and their parties. And of course, they're there to represent the country. If they're with an issue such as Brexit or an issue such as military action or so on, MPs are there to represent what does the whole country need as a whole, and they might have particular causes. The word there is causal representation, not casual representation, before you write that down wrong, being the idea that actually people might have a particular issue that they care about passionately, like animal rights or equality, or people might have a big health concern that they particularly care about, or so on. So an MP can actually be quite a complex creature. And when they're making their decisions, when they are campaigning, when they are going on to select committees, when they're doing whatever they do, they will be attempting to fulfill quite a lot of different representative roles, and of course they will do some better than others, and of course it's quite a complex idea, but an MP fulfills quite a lot of different forms of representation. That's the point I'm making here. And so if you were writing an essay about representation, bringing in this idea that a representative represents in different ways would make your essay richer, and also gives you a better understanding of kind of how our political system works, really. So let's extend this idea a little bit and talk about, well, what exactly is in the head of a representative when they either vote on legislation or do much of the rest of their work, which is very important in being an MP. And one of the things that you'll find increasingly when you go towards university, and especially if you take a subject like psychology or sociology, you'll see these ideas a lot. But you get something called models. And models, obviously gorgeous people on TV and Instagram are models. But what we're talking about here is kind of theoretical models, ways of thinking about how something is, or a way of understanding what is taking place. And what I'm going to show you here is 3 different ways that perhaps we can think of how MPs can make a decision. And then what we can do, and what I'd like you to start doing, is think about which of these you think is the truest, the most realistic, the most true most of the time, the one you think that best understands it, or maybe even in your head, like, what do you think they should be doing? I've just moved myself to the center here so I can kind of bring things up around me. So the first model is the idea that MPs are delegates, keyword here in bold. Representatives also have to decide whether to be delegates for their constituents, merely putting forward their view. So the first model is the idea that the representative from Watford is a delegate for Watford, and every decision they make in Parliament and every action they do should be based on what the people in Watford want, because that was who voted them in, and they were voted in to be my representative. This idea has strengths and weaknesses. First of all, good. You're the representative from Watford, so you should be representing what people in Watford want. But how do you know what people in Watford want? I mean, you probably have letters, and you probably get emails and petitions, but it's the vast minority of people that actually contact their MP. I mean, I guess you've rarely contacted your MP. I don't think I've ever contacted my local MP. So an MP doesn't really have a true picture of what people want. Exceptions might be if there's been a recent referendum, for example on Brexit, they might be able to say, well, my area had 60-40 or 30-70 or whatever. But most of the time, you'd have to guess that an MP doesn't really know what his or her constituents think, unless they spend a lot of their time engaging with their constituents and holding events to which people can kind of express their views. But at the same time, the whole point of our parliamentary system is there is a representative from each area of the country. So it would stand to reason that our MPs should be delegates, first and foremost representing the area that has sent them to Parliament. But in contrast to that, the second model is what we're going to call the party model, which is that they are a representative of their party, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats. And actually what should be going on in their heads is how best to be Conservative, Labour, Liberal, and so on. And they should be thinking about how to best support their leader, how to get their leader into government, how to make their government successful, and their loyalty, there's a good word to talk about here, should be with their parties more than it should be with their constituents. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this? Well, our government only really functions if it has loyal MPs and a whipping system that works. If Boris Johnson, who's the current Prime Minister, was not able to command the obedience of his MPs most of the time on most issues, he wouldn't be able to have a functioning government. So party representation is important. If all of his MPs were kind of going, oh, well, I'm not sure that's right for Scotland or Wales or Blackpool, he would struggle to kind of get things through or to have a kind of a smoothly functioning government. Whether he has a smoothly functioning government is, of course, another issue. But on the other hand, most people vote in their heads for a party. Most people vote for a manifesto. Most people vote with an idea that they want a conservative representative or a liberal representative and so on, and therefore they would want them to continue to kind of vote along those lines. The third model is that an MP should actually just use their best personal judgment to make decisions. Now, this is either known as trustee representation, i.e. you trust the representative to make decisions for you, but it's also sometimes known as Burkean representation, because this was an argument put forward by a man called Edward Burke, or Edmund Burke, spelt B-U-R-K-E, and we'll be looking at him when we get to ideologies later in the course, but he was very strongly of the opinion that MPs are representative to give you their best judgment, and he argued that an MP is there to make decisions on your behalf by using their own judgment, not necessarily to think about what you want, but to think about what they think is best for you or for the country or for the party, and so on. And so we have these three different models here of how MPs could make decisions. Do they always think about their local area? Do they always think about their party? Or do they just use their own opinions because they have been representatives? And when you vote, when you go and vote and you see a ballot paper, it does say their name first. You know, you vote for Mr. Cox or Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones or Mrs. I've run out of random surnames, Mrs. O'Connor or something like that. You vote for an individual, and yes, that individual is attached to a party, but it is a person that has been voted for. So I wonder what you think an MP should do. And I also wonder what you think MPs actually do. What happens in the UK system? Maybe think about what happens in the American system, and in other countries from your experience. This is one of the things we'll be talking about in the seminar. And of course, there may be, and this is kind of like a little aside, so these three are the big three. This is a minor one, so in your notes, make this smaller or off to one side. There may, of course, be other things in their mind, something about the national interest, the causal interests, their personal representation of their personal demographics, and so on. So, for example, David Lammy, who is a Labour MP, is very well known for campaigning on issues for black rights, because that's his personal demographic, and he was very active during the Black Lives Matter campaigns and things like that, which doesn't necessarily fit any of the other three models, but does kind of fit a particular cause or a kind of a social representation that he is passionate about. So it is quite kind of complex. But when you're talking about representation in an essay, I would expect to see discussions of these three different models there. And it also shows how you understand how kind of Parliament functions. So in the last section of this lecture, we're going to be talking about, well, so what is good, what is bad, what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of representative democracy. And we'll start off with what's good about it. Some of this, by the way, is going to seem quite patronizing and a little bit kind of insulting, but I hope you will understand where we're kind of coming from here. And if you want to criticize these ideas, then of course you can, but at least give them an airing. The first idea here is that representatives may be more rational, more educated and balanced than individual citizens. Now just think about all of the people you know, the cleverest people and the not so clever people, the rational people and the people that are very kind of, I don't know, a little bit enthusiastic, let's say. Do you trust all of them to make decisions? Would you trust all of them as your delegate? Would you trust them with your life, your security, your home, etc., etc.? And so the idea here is that the MP is a particular type of person who may well be more rational, more well educated, more balanced than other individuals. There are more private school educated people in Parliament than there should be, according to like a percentage demographic. So I think it's something like 5 to 10% of people go to a private school, but in Parliament I think it's something like 40 to 50% of people are the representatives. You might check that statistic, but private schools are overrepresented, which is not good unless you make the argument that having a really good education might make you more rational, more balanced, and a better representative. Think back to direct democracy for a minute. One of the issues with direct democracy was that we just don't have time to make all these decisions ourselves, to research every single idea and make a decision based on it. So the people cannot be expected to have the time or even the interest to make important and regular decisions. And so having a representative to do that means that you can kind of delegate that decision to someone else. So a practical concern there. Third one, representatives are supposed to ensure that the interests of all sections of society, including minorities, are taken into account. Now, remember, one of the disadvantages of direct democracy was what we call the tyranny of the majority. If 51% of people want something, then they can ignore what the 49% of people don't want. Because it's a simple majority. The idea here is that a representative is able to think about, well, what is in the best interests of everyone? Where will a minority be unfairly penalized by the actions here of the majority? And so it kind of links with the first one in a way, and it kind of puts these ideas together. But the idea is that a representative will kind of look at all of the issues, look at all of the people involved who are affected and impacted by it. You might kind of say, well, yeah, you really want that. But if just because you want that, that's actually really going to harm this small group over here, and therefore we're not going to do it. Whether representatives do that is another question. Representatives should be able to combine the differing demands of people into a more coherent and politically logical program. I mentioned in the previous video that direct democracy has a problem, is that people want low taxes, great education, great security, great public services and so on, and that's not coherent. You can't have great services and low taxes because you have to pay for them. And so the idea here is that a professional representative who is more rational, educated and balanced will be able to kind of work within a party system to combine the needs of the country with a balanced taxation system and all the other things to kind of put all these different ideas together into what we call a politically logical program, an idea that, and also an idea that everything is taken care of. So you might be very interested in education and parks, and you might not care at all about fishing, but actually laws still need to be made about fishing, and so having a representative that can kind of build this idea into a larger program is important. A representative can be held accountable. Dominic Grieve was voted out, but you're not accountable. If we had a direct democracy and everyone voted for this or everyone voted for that, you can't sack yourself. You can't sack the neighbour next door. Who is accountable for the Brexit referendum result? I mean, ultimately it's the people, but how do you disagree with the people? How do you vote them out? How do you say I disagree with that decision, or even I agree with that decision, I want to vote for you again? With representative democracy, you always have the choice to keep them, to vote for them again, or to remove them if you don't like them. They are accountable for their decisions. So far it sounds pretty good. We have these wonderful, beautiful representatives who make these glorious decisions on our behalfs, who we can remove if we don't like, and who make decisions on the basis of looking after everyone. However, what are the flaws in this system? Well, representatives aren't all that accountable. One vote every 5 years perhaps isn't a great amount of accountability. There is now something called recall elections in the UK, which I'm sure we actually have talked about. If not, we will talk. They will come up again. But a recall election is a way to remove an MP between elections, but you can only do it if they've done something really illegal. You can't just use it randomly for random things. And also, you could make an argument that actually MPs in certain locations aren't particularly accountable anyway. If they live in what we call a safe seat, they're not going to lose their seat. And when we look at electoral systems in a month's time or so on, you'll understand what that means. But essentially, there are certain places in the UK where the Conservatives will always win, or Labour will always win, regardless of how that particular MP behaves. Secondly, the electoral mandate of representatives is flawed, as voters have to accept or reject a whole manifesto, not being able to make clear which parts of it they oppose or indeed agree with. Now, let's just imagine this envelope here was the manifesto of a particular party, and let's say you get to read this manifesto and you go, yep, I love this, I love this, I love this, oh, great policy on education, great policy on defence, ooh, hate this bit here on Brexit, don't like this bit here on Corona, but you only have one vote, and you can only vote Labour or Conservative or Lib Dem or SNP, whatever it is. There's no way for you as a voter to say yes, yes, no, no. And so there's an argument to be made here that representative democracy doesn't work, because the way we vote doesn't really allow you to express your views accurately or coherently. You only get to vote this person or that person. You don't really get to be able to say in our electoral system what you feel about individual topics, which obviously affects their ability to represent you. Conflicting representation may make it hard for MPs to make decisions. It actually says see next slide, but I mean the previous slide. You know, whether the party representation, delegate model, Burkean model, an MP may be pulled in different directions by different factors, which might make their decision making not helpful or not really work properly, or might make you as a constituent frustrated. If you, so say for example, you were, I'll use the Dominic Grieve example. If you live in a Brexit constituency but your MP repeatedly votes Remain, you might then feel that their representation, they've used the wrong model. They're being a delegate, sorry, they're being a trustee, whereas actually you want them to be more of a delegate in their behaviour. And lastly, of course, once you vote for a representative and they're in Parliament, they may well act in their own interest. There are unfortunately many stories of corruption and bribery and MPs and members of Parliament and ministers taking money on the sly or doing things that kind of benefit them. And of course, MPs are always very concerned with re-election. So when they make decisions, they may make a decision which is for the good of the country, but they also may make a decision that they feel just benefits their re-election process. In America, in the House of Representatives, they have elections every 2 years, which effectively means they are always re-electing. They are always thinking about the next election campaign. We have a bit of a bigger gap here. Like, I don't think you'd be saying right now in 2021 we're thinking general election, but over the next 2 years that will be in the minds of MPs, and thinking about what voters will do in the future. So these are some of the issues that occur with representative democracy, some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses. What do you think of it as a system? I think Winston Churchill once said something, and I'm going to get the quote wrong here, but he said something along the lines of democracy is the least worst system we can have, i.e. it's flawed, it has all sorts of problems, but there isn't really a better system. However, China has a more kind of one-party state, and they seem to think that it works fine. Maybe not all the people, but China is a growing success country in the world at the moment, using a different political system that's not democracy. So maybe democracy isn't the right system for our country or a country. Maybe representative democracy isn't the right system for our country. Maybe direct democracy is better. Or maybe, as Churchill says, representative democracy is the least worst option and it's the best one we have. Or maybe you think it's great. Maybe actually you look at these strengths and you think, yes, this is exactly how I think a country should make decisions. Either way, Go grab your textbook, have a good read about representative democracy, find the pages. I haven't got them close to hand here, but I'll try and find them before the lesson. Read it through, have a think, jot down some ideas, put your ideas down the side of your notes in a different colour so you can kind of see your thoughts there, and be prepared to discuss it at our next seminar. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this informative, and I've taken lots of notes and I'm now an expert in representative democracy, and I will see you at our next seminar and our next lesson. Take care, bye-bye. Subscribe, like the channel, all that kind of stuff.